Hey there, this is Ryan Eckert with Peak Endurance Solutions. Thank you for purchasing an Xterra triathlon training plan from my Training Peaks training plan library. The point of this video is to give you a general overview of the training plan, some of the features that this plan has, as well as some of the different documents and things that you get alongside this plan. For the purpose of this video, I have an advanced 20-week Xterra long course triathlon training plan up for the purpose of the video, but this video is applicable to any Xterra training plan that is purchased from my Training Peaks training plan library. I'll point out some of the differences between the beginner plans and the intermediate and advanced plans when those differences come up. But in general, this is just giving an overview of some of the basic features and functions of the plan, and those are fairly universal across the different levels of plan and the different distances of plan. So you'll notice when you purchase one of these Xterra training plans that on week 1, day 1, there's this introduction note card. If you go here, this is where you will have hopefully first clicked on this video link that you're watching now. Once you're done with that, you want to go ahead and go down to the bottom of the note card, or sometimes the top, depending on if you're viewing it on your phone or online, and open up this instruction booklet. So when you click on this, a PDF document will download, and when you open it up, it'll look like this. So this document is, I would argue, is very important to read for the purpose of completing this plan appropriately. This will give you an overview of, again, some of the main features and functions in the plan, as well as go over some other important topics related to endurance sport and racing and training. So you'll see that there is a table of contents that gives you an overview of what you're going to be reviewing in this document. So first section is just a brief intro, and then an overview of Training Peaks and the layout and content of the training plan. So I would read through this, especially if you're newer to Training Peaks. So let's say you have maybe a beginner or an intermediate plan, but you've never used Training Peaks before, or even an advanced plan. This gives you also an overview of some of the layout of Training Peaks, what some of the different pages are and what you'll see on those pages. It gives you an intro into some of the different types of sessions that you're going to see in these in the Xterra training plans, and then as well as what the color coding means on Training Peaks. If you're new to Training Peaks, the workouts, when you've completed them, uploaded your workout, and it's synced with the planned workout for the day, it'll light up a variety of different colors. So this just gives you an idea as to like what makes a workout light up green versus yellow, orange, red, or gray. And then the next section just gives you an intro into some of the partners that we work with. You have access to a couple different discounts here through some companies that we work with, such as Roca, Moxie Life, Jack Grew, and Q Activewear. And then goal setting, so a brief overview of just some basics related to goal setting. So this may be useful for you if you're looking to set some specific goals for your race or throughout training. And then these next couple sections are rather important. So most coaches have some terminology and basic terms that they use with athletes or with other coaches. I also have some terminology and some basic terms that I use as well. I try and keep those terms that I use fairly broad and universal across different coaches or athletes and the type of language that they may use. But obviously there may be some specific terms or things that I use throughout the training plan that you just want to know what they mean. So this is giving you an overview of, for example, some of those specific terms that I use and what they mean and what they're relating to. So first I go over some of the basic ways that I prescribe intensity. So rating of perceived exertion, or RPE. If you have a beginner or an intermediate plan, you'll see, or even an advanced plan, you'll see that some sessions are prescribed based on an RPE scale. If you have a beginner plan, all sessions, swim, bike, and run, are prescribed based on perceived exertion. If you have an intermediate or advanced plan, those, for intermediate plans, sessions on the swim and bike are going to be prescribed based on perceived exertion, and the run will be prescribed on percentage of your threshold running pace. Advanced plans will prescribe just the swim based on perceived exertion, and then the bike and the run based on a percentage of your threshold. So for perceived exertion, there's different scales out there. I prefer this 1 to 10 scale. It just makes the most sense to me. Essentially a 1 or a 2. So a 1 is like you're laying down and resting. Maybe not necessarily asleep. Asleep would be like a 0. You're exerting no effort other than just basic biological functions while you're sleeping. But imagine you're laying in bed and like reading a book maybe. That would be what I would call a 1. And then a 2 would be doing very little. So maybe it's like doing some basic household chores, or like doing some light gardening or things around the home, or like doing maybe some work, like some office work. You're moving around in the office. So that's a 2. And then a 3 and a 4, we start to get into exercise territory. So think of 3 and a 4 as very, very easy. This is like warm up pace, cool down pace, like active recovery, or just very, very light, easy training. 5 and 6 gets into what I call kind of moderate or aerobic pace. Some people call it long, slow distance or LSD. But this is essentially your aerobic pace. So this is like comfortable. You can do it for long periods of time, but it's a step up above like very, very, very easy. And then we start to get into 7 and 8, which would be a little bit more a little bit harder of an intensity. So this would be like vigorous intensity. So think like you're having to work a little bit to keep up with the pace, but it's not so hard that you couldn't maintain it for a somewhat reasonable period of time, like 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, all the way up to maybe 60 minutes at most. And then when you get into a 9 or a 10 on this scale, this would be like very short, hard, maximal, like high intensity efforts. So think like really high intensity interval training, or maybe like a mile all out, or like even maybe up to a 5K at most for some people. So this is giving you an overview of that scale. And then if you go to the next page, it's going to go over training zones and how that rating of perceived exertion lines up with different training zones. So I like to use a classic 5 training zone model. So with zone 1 through 5. So zone 1 is easy, zone 2 is aerobic, 3 and 4 are tempo efforts that are kind of around your threshold. And then 5 would be like a VO2 max or sprint interval to some degree. So this just shows you what RPE corresponds with which zone, as well as what percentage of your maximum heart rate, what swim pace, run pace, and cycling power would correspond with those zones as well. And then the next couple topics, or the next couple sections in this chapter, relate to what the different terms that I use to describe certain training sessions mean. So I try and keep things very, very simple, basic, and fairly universal. Some people have, unique terms or terminology for certain types of sessions. I just pretty much, for the most part, prescribe sessions and title them as one of 4 different types of sessions. Except for when you start to get later into a plan, I may incorporate some race pace sessions, but I explain what race pace means depending on which distance you are racing. But in general, throughout the plan, you're going to notice that I prescribe sessions as easy, aerobic, tempo, or interval. So this goes over what those different labels or terms mean. But essentially think of easy as, easy warm up, like cool down or recovery sessions. Aerobic is kind of what you're going to do the most of. It's, your everyday bread and butter, kind of comfortable aerobic engine building and developing sessions. Tempo are going to be some sessions that are maybe a little bit harder than aerobic, so maybe a little bit below your threshold, which you'll determine what your threshold is on the bike and the run in intermediate and advanced plans, as well as the swim. But you won't be determining your threshold for beginner plans. So I do tell or say and prescribe sessions based and call them tempo sessions, but it's all based on perceived exertion. But if you do know what your threshold is, and your threshold like paces on the run or in the swim, or threshold power is on the bike, then a tempo effort is essentially something that's either a little bit below it, around it, or ever so slightly above it, but not by much above. And then an interval session is going to be things that are above your threshold. So things that are like 2, 3, 4% above your threshold or higher. So these will be like really short, hard efforts. The next section goes over resistance training. So resistance training is fairly straightforward to follow in Training Peaks nowadays. They've done some updates in recent years in which it makes it really easy to prescribe resistance training to be done remotely by athletes. And I'll go over what that looks like here in a second. But this section just gives you a basic overview of why resistance training is important it is what I would consider a non-negotiable activity to be doing for endurance athletes, but just for anyone in general, regardless of whether you're an endurance athlete, a strength and power athlete, a team sport athlete like playing baseball or rugby or whatever it is. Strength training, especially now for endurance athletes, is a non-negotiable thing to be doing. Not only just for general health and wellness, there are a lot of important health benefits that you get that are very unique to resistance training. Especially as you start to get older and older. Resistance training becomes incredibly important for maintaining quality of life and basic levels of function and resilience and strength. But also for endurance athletes, there are some injury prevention benefits to be had, as well as some performance enhancing benefits related to strength training. So I go over that here in a little bit, and then I link to a blog post that I've written on my website that essentially goes over the science behind strength training for endurance athletes in a lot more detail if you want to learn about that. And then I go over maximizing recovery, so just kind of covering some of the basics related to recovery. So nothing fancy here, just how sleep is involved, linking to, again, more information on sleep and how that is related to recovery. Honestly, sleep, nutrition, and hydration are some of the biggest foundational components of recovery. There's all sorts of fancy recovery gadgets and modalities out there nowadays, but honestly, those are just marginally improving recovery capacity at best. Usually they don't do much at all, but honestly, nothing beats sleep. Sleep is the foundation, and then hydration, good hydration and good nutrition are the other two major important factors. So this just kind of covers some of those basics. And then recovering after races, maybe less relevant in a training plan where it builds you up to one race at the end of the plan. But if you do incorporate other races along the way in the build up to your main race at the end of this plan, then this will give you just some of my recommendations into like what that recovery after that race should maybe look like. And then some basic sports nutrition topics. So just kind of covering the basics of just general healthy eating to fuel performance and recovery. And then I give some links to some more in-depth reading if you're interested in that. And then just a table at the end that goes over some evidence-based nutrition recommendations for before, during, and after training. So this may be useful, especially with triathletes. Usually most of our races take bare minimum an hour, sometimes a lot more, up to 17 hours for an Ironman. But for Xterra purposes, it's going to be an hour to 3 or 4 hours, maybe even slightly longer, depending on how long it's going to take you to complete your event, how challenging the terrain is that you're racing on. So fueling before and especially during becomes extremely relevant for triathletes and for those who are doing Xterra related events. So this may be very useful for you. And these are, again, evidence-based guidelines that give you a very basic overview of fueling before, during, and after. And then just a brief overview of preparing for race day, kind of what the taper looks like and what to expect during the taper. And then I just will conclude with my contact information. So this is an email that you can reach out to me at anytime. You can also go to my website, which is peakenduranceSolutions.com. And through there, I also list other ways of getting in touch with me, primarily my email, but also there's a contact form on my website that I'll see. It'll just come right to my email inbox as well. So if you ever have any questions, you can always reach out to me at any time. I'm more than happy to help you. And then I also link in here what I call my VO2 Max forum. It's essentially my blog that I have on my website. And I have a bunch of different posts now on a variety of different topics related to endurance sport. Essentially what I do in those, I like to call them science posts. I basically will do a little bit of a deep dive into some science on a particular topic that's relevant for endurance sport. And then I kind of summarize that research so that just, the average person can read it, digest it, and hopefully learn something that they can apply to their endurance training. Or even if you're a coach out there, you can learn some things and maybe apply it to the coaching that you do with athletes as well. It's a super valuable resource if you like to read and you like to read about different endurance related topics and some of the science on that topic. So I highly recommend that you check this out. If you're looking for answers to a certain thing or for more information on a certain thing that's related to endurance sport, I've probably written on it or have written something that's close to it. And I'm usually adding to this regularly with new posts. All right, so then once you're done with this instruction document, you will be ready to take on this plan. If you have an intermediate or an advanced plan, I have one final note in here. This is to get your resting heart rate the next morning before you start to do some of your testing. You'll need this in order to determine some of your heart rate training zones. If you know what your resting heart rate is, because you wear like a device like a watch or something that tracks your resting heart rate, you can just use what your average resting overnight heart rate is. But otherwise, another way to do it is to just first thing in the morning when you get up, before getting out of bed, lay there, kind of maybe do a couple deep breaths just to get your heart rate down, and then get your resting heart rate so that you have that resting heart rate number when you're ready to set up your training zones. Once you do that, then you're ready to essentially take on this training plan. So you'll notice that there are some testing sessions in the first week for intermediate and advanced plans. Again, if you have a beginner plan, there are no testing sessions. You're more than welcome to do your own testing sessions. You can usually look up fairly easily what some bike specific, swim specific, and run specific threshold tests are. There's a variety of different types of tests out there. You can do pretty much any test that you want that estimates what your threshold is. Most of them are fairly decent. They all have their own pros and cons, but I use some specific tests that I found that tend to work fairly well. So if you are participating or using a beginner plan, you can obviously do your own testing and set up your own training zones if you want. But I do prescribe everything in beginner plans based on perceived exertion just for simplicity. And I think that's a really good way to start sometimes, is just to get familiar with your rating of perceived exertion during exercise. But for intermediate and advanced plans, you have these testing sessions to do. In the first testing session, I link in here a training zones Excel spreadsheet. This will be really useful for you when you're done with your testing, and as you complete the different tests, you can plug in your numbers and get a nice spreadsheet that summarizes all of your training zones. So all you got to do is plug in your age. So let's say you're 40 years old. Let's say your resting heartbeat is 55. You'll already see just with those two data points, your heart rate ranges are going to adjust. So these are calculated based on your heart rate reserve, which is essentially your age predicted maximum heart rate minus your resting heart rate, and then you calculate zones based on that. Obviously, this is only as accurate as your age predicted maximum heart rate is and your resting heart rate. If you know what your maximum heart rate is, you can change this number, and then it will obviously update these training zones. But the more accurate of a resting heart rate and a max heart rate you have, the better. Again, this just uses a very basic formula to estimate it. There's a lot of error with this, but this is without obviously knowing what your max heart rate is. This is just one of the better ways of estimating it. So once you do that, then you'll have your heart rate zones. And then when you do your first test, you can plug in your threshold numbers. So you can plug in things for each test like your threshold pace, your threshold heart rate, threshold power. So if you have a power meter on the run, if you bike with power, you can get your threshold power. So you can plug those numbers in. The most important ones to get on the run are going to be pace. When you know your pace, you'll plug in the pace per mile here. If you prefer the metric system, you can use kilometer, and you can change all this to kilometers. But once you have that pace, then you just have to calculate by converting your pace over to speed and then multiplying that speed by these percentages and then converting that back to pace to get your pace zones. There's probably a way to set this up in Excel so that it does it automatically, but I couldn't necessarily figure it out at the time when I made this chart. I may at some point update it so that it does auto-calculate, but for now, there is a link here that takes you to a pretty convenient calculator where you can swap back and forth. Actually, here it is, where you can swap back and forth between, you can plug in what your minute and second per mile is, and it will convert it over to miles per hour, minutes and seconds per kilometer, kilometers per hour. So you can do all that math here. Makes it nice and easy for you to do it. On the bike, all you got to do here is just plug in your threshold power, and then you'll see your zones will update. And then also it gives you some recommended pace ranges for different distances. Obviously for Xterra, the primary ones you're interested in are Olympic distance and sprint distance, which is short and long course. And then on the swim, you have to manually calculate this as well. So for this, let's say it's a minute 30 per 100. Doesn't matter if it's yards or meters. I usually use yards because I'm based out of the US, but if you use meters, it's just kind of neutral. So it's just per 100. And then all you got to do to calculate your paces is just add a certain amount of time or subtract a certain amount of time from that pace, and then your swim zones. Again, these are more useful to know. That's not required because swimming is prescribed on perceived exertion for every plan. But you can also update your swim pace training zones in Training Peaks. Just make sure that it's capturing accurate training zone related data with your swim file. On the bike, again, heart rate, cycling power, that's all you really need. You don't really need your threshold speed. You can put it in here. And then when you replicate this test in the future, you can see if you do it on the same course, you can see if your speed at all has changed. Sometimes that's nice to know if maybe your threshold doesn't change very much, but your speed is improved. That means you're becoming more aerodynamically efficient, which is good. Or maybe you upgraded from a road bike to, or a mountain bike, you change your mountain bike around, change the setup around to be a little bit more aerodynamically efficient. You can maybe see that in some of that data if you capture speed as well. Your threshold heart rate, you can plug that in as well. I tell you how to calculate that when you do these tests. It's just nice to know that as well. Sometimes your threshold heart rate will go up, which can be a good thing as you gain fitness. Sometimes it can go down when you lose fitness, so it's nice to know that number as well. You can plug that in for the swim, the bike, and the run. Well, not so much the swim, unless you really want to. You can wear a heart rate monitor when you swim, but most people don't. But that's how you use this Excel spreadsheet. I like to set up Excel spreadsheets for all the athletes I coach like this, and then go into Training Peaks and manually input training zones based on this Excel spreadsheet. That's what I would recommend when you're doing this. I wouldn't necessarily recommend fiddling around with like the different ways of calculating training zones and Training Peaks, because they are dramatically different from one calculation to the next. These are just some fairly standard training zones that I find tend to work fairly well for most people, especially as they get a little bit more in tune with how to do these tests appropriately and pace them. And as they start to kind of gain some fitness and get some regular training in, these training zones can be fairly accurate for most people. So I give you an overview of how to update training zones at the end of these testing sessions. But basically when you go in your settings, you can plug in training zones, heart rate zones for each individual sport. I would recommend just making them identical to what's in the Excel spreadsheet. That's what I recommend. Obviously, you're free to do whatever you want and what makes the most sense to you, but that's just what I recommend if you're following along to my plan. It doesn't necessarily impact how the training sessions are prescribed to you, because they're prescribed based on whatever percentage of your threshold you have achieved. It's just the percentages of those zones may be wildly different depending on the calculation that you do or that you choose. So again, I recommend setting up your zones with what's in the Excel spreadsheet when you set that up. Once you're done with week 1, then you're done with the testing sessions for intermediate and advanced plans. And then you'll notice for all of your sessions throughout the plan, they are titled with an A, a B, or a C before the workout title. So this is not necessarily identifying which sessions are most important and least important. Every single session is important because they all kind of contribute to the overall fitness that you're building throughout the training plan, and they all serve a very specific purpose. So there's not necessarily one session that's not important. They all are relatively important, but this A, B, and C structure allows you to kind of individualize the training plan a little bit based on your schedule and your life outside of training. So the way that I like to approach A, B, and C structured plans is think of A sessions as if you're looking at your week ahead, A sessions are the ones you want to make sure that you get in no matter what, if possible. And then if you absolutely have to get rid of a session for whatever reason, whether time constraints or just energy, the C sessions are the ones that you want to get rid of or modify and shorten first. So like, for example, if you're looking at this week ahead, usually there's 1 or 2 C sessions and maybe 1 or 2 B sessions each week. If you're looking at the week ahead and you go, I just got to modify something because I don't have the time to do everything, you could get rid of this C session and that knocks off 20 minutes after this bike ride. If that's still not enough, or you could get rid of the second recovery session, which is a C session, a recovery bike. You could get rid of those 2 sessions or even just one of them if you need just one day off to do things and go from there. If you really need to modify further beyond the C sessions, then that's where you go to the B sessions and either shorten them, modify them slightly if you absolutely have to get rid of them. And then hopefully at the very least, you're getting in all of your A sessions each week. If you get in at least all of the A sessions every single week, you'll still be set up to do well in the race that you're training for. Obviously, you will potentially have a little bit more fitness and be a little bit more prepared if you do all of the sessions. But if doing every single session every single week is too draining for you and you don't because of time or whatever it is, obviously you want to make sure you're fresh when you get to race day and you're not injured, you're not burnt out. So if that's the case, then this gives you the flexibility to remove the C sessions or B sessions each week as needed, and you can do a little bit less volume and still be well prepared. But again, in a perfect world, you would do all of the training that's in this plan. But again, I know that, for whatever reason, whether it's work schedule, social life, family outside of training, just whatever else you do outside of triathlon, you may not have the time nor the energy to fit in every single session. So I've tried to build out these plans so that they are built out in, with assuming someone has a reasonable amount of time outside of whatever else they're doing with their life to dedicate to triathlon. This is what kind of my ideal scenario would look like for a training plan. But my ideal doesn't fit with everyone else's ideal and reality. So again, that's where this A, B, and C structure is going to be really useful for you and gives a little bit of individual flexibility for the athlete depending on who is following this plan. And then as you go throughout the plan, you'll notice I have some notes put in here that are important and when they become relevant. So this one's on like setting up and using training zones. This just gives you a little bit more information related to how to set up and use and interpret training zones and training peaks. And then you'll just kind of follow along to the plan. And then at the end of the plan, obviously, it's going to conclude with your race that you are building towards. And then I give a little bit of an overview as to some important things related to race week and the taper, things like that. But that's essentially what to expect from this plan. They progress very gradually, and they should progress in a way that allows you, as long as you're doing at bare minimum at least the A sessions each week, you should have no problem kind of progressing gently and gradually throughout the plan to your key race at the end of the training plan. So that is a general overview of the Xterra training plans. If you ever have any questions related to this training plan or anything else, whether it's something on my website or even if you're interested in one-on-one coaching in the future, feel free to reach out to me on my email, which is peakenduranceSolutions@outlook.com, or you can always go to my website, peakenduranceSolutions.com as well.